With continued uncertainty about the Brexit process, many people are pressing for a further referendum on Brexit. This raises various important questions.
The first question is whether it's possible to hold a referendum, and many people think that we just don't have time before we're due to leave the EU. And holding a referendum does take quite a lot of time. First, in order to hold a referendum, we need to legislate, and getting the legislation through Parliament takes a period. And then we need time to organise a campaign and run a campaign. And we think all of that takes 22 weeks, which takes you beyond Brexit Day on the 29th of March. So then the question is, well, can we move Brexit Day? Can we extend that period? And it's very clear that in law we can, and it's also clear that although we need the consent of all the member states of the EU to do that, they will give that consent in order to allow a referendum to take place.
Could I urge the Prime Minister again to think again about whether at this stage we should go back to the people, present them with the options?
Isn't it time now for the British people to take back control from this place, for her to extend Article 50 and let the people decide in a people's vote?
The government has repeatedly said that it doesn't want to hold a referendum, but there are various ways in which this could be forced by Parliament. If a deal is reached with the EU, then government has to put this to the House of Commons for approval. One way that a referendum could happen is through the House of Commons making approval of the deal conditional on a referendum being held to get the people's agreement to the deal. Alternatively, the Commons might simply vote to reject the deal, which would lead to a kind of deadlock, and in the ensuing days and weeks, the government or Parliament might reach for a referendum in order to break that deadlock. If there is no deal finally signed off, or if the Cabinet decides not to put that deal to Parliament, then Parliament still has a say. We're once again in a kind of deadlock situation where a referendum could offer the way out of the deadlock. Basically, neither the government nor the majority of MPs want us to face a no-deal Brexit, and if that seems to be where we're heading, then a referendum could offer the way out. There are three basic options that could be considered in a referendum: voting for the government's deal, voting for a no-deal Brexit, or voting to remain in the EU. Some people might think there's a fourth option of continuing the negotiations, but that seems very unlikely to be agreed by the EU, so we don't consider it any further here.
When it comes to the structure of the ballot paper, again, there are three ways of doing it. The first way would be to have a simple yes-no question on the deal. The trouble with that is it's not clear what no means. What would happen if people didn't accept the deal? So we think that isn't a viable option.
Another format would be a referendum that pits two of the three options against each other. If there's no deal, then clearly there are only two options left on the table. So a no deal versus remain referendum is completely viable, and that's pretty straightforward. If there is a deal, you could pit the deal against remain, which is what many people want, and it's definitely viable, but it could create frustration amongst those who want a kind of hard Brexit or would prefer the no deal option. In theory, you could pit no deal against the deal, but that would leave Remainers extremely frustrated, and frankly, it seems very unlikely to get through Parliament.
The third approach would be to have all three options on the ballot paper. And if you were simply to ask voters to choose their favourite option, the trouble with that is that you could split the vote, and it may well be that no option has a clear majority. So if you do have three options on the ballot paper, then you need to use a preferential ballot so voters can order the three options according to their preferences.
Aside from the referendum question, the legislation would have to set out various rules for the referendum. One of them is what the franchise should be, that is, who should be able to vote. There are some quite strong arguments to extend the franchise, for example, to 16 to 17-year-olds or to EU nationals living in the UK. But those groups were excluded from the franchise in the 2016 referendum, and it could be fundamentally quite problematic to be seen to be overturning the result of that referendum through what might look like a procedural fix. So we think that the franchise should remain as it was in 2016.
The last referendum also revealed various problems with the rules around referendums, perhaps most notably the lack of any regulation of digital campaigning. And so those sorts of issues would need to be addressed before we held a further referendum.
So in conclusion, a referendum is possible, and in the coming weeks, government and Parliament will decide whether there should be one.